Wandering samurai stories always have a certain charm to them, but at the same time, I'm always a little wary of the quality of them, given how easy it is to pump out formulaic wandering samurai stories that have probably been seen and done plenty of times over. I will say, I didn't really know what to expect going in, but I will say that as I watched that first episode of Carried by the Wind, I was basically immediately blown away by the charm that this anime was able to portray. And you know, I kind of felt it was something that I wanted to make my first episode of this Decoded series on, kind of trying to explain what about this makes this charming. Now, let's be honest, was this formulaic? Absolutely. But I don't think that really takes away from the charm and the artistic takeaways from an anime like this. And I'm not going to harp too much on the repetitive nature of the episodes or anything like that, as this is not a review where I end it by giving a rating or anything like that. This is simply a breakdown of the standout elements that make this anime enjoyable. My goal here on Anime Decoded is to take different animes, cartoons, or just general animated media, break it down, talk to you about the different elements that make it a signature style, so that maybe if you liked the work, you could take it and understand how to replicate something similar so that you could use those artistic choices in your own work. But without further ado, let's get into this. I had a lot of fun making this video, and I'm happy to say that this will be the beginning of my first Decoded video, Carried by the Wind, Tsukikage-ran, Decoded. Let's get into it. This anime was first aired on January 26th, the year 2000. Written and directed by Akitori Daichi and produced by Madhouse Studio. The inspiration for this anime comes from a genre of samurai films fairly popular at this time known as Janbara. Janbara films are more or less the Japanese equivalent of American westerns, usually consisting of having its highlights being samurai culture and cool sword fights. While researching, I read the brainstorming of each episode was done by the title and writing the entire plot of each episode based off of it, which of course kind of tickles my brain a little bit to know that quite a bit of fun was taken in brainstorming each of these episodes. And the fun nature of it really does shine in the direction the series takes in production. So the way these videos are going to work is that I'm going to break down the anime into a few categories. For this one, I think the ones I'm going to hit on the most is character design, art style, and elements of animation. For this Decoded series, I definitely plan to do a lot more, such as having segments where I try to imitate the art style based on kind of what we've decoded from it. And maybe even further down the line, if I feel more confident, I would even do like a rough little animation kind of talking about some of the animation dynamics displayed in the show. But for right now, since I'm still working a full-time job and doing this, I definitely don't have the time to animate, but you know, something to reach for. In addition to this, I'll also go over some other odds and ends, like I will for sure go over the music and sound effects used in this, because that definitely is a highlight of what makes this style stylistic to this anime. And in this video, I will go over talking about kind of in terms of story writing, what kind of the thoughts and feelings were provoked by the writing, and kind of a little bit of the format of how each episode happens. So this is an episodic anime, and there isn't really an overarching story. I won't really go too deep into the fundamentals of storytelling like I might in some other videos, but I for sure will definitely hit some points as to what makes the way each one of these episodic stories are told signature to this anime. Now, as I mentioned, we will start with our first section, which is character design. Starting with the face and head, we'll use Ran for an example. Let's just put her on the screen to use her as the case study, as probably fitting for the main character. So first things first, when it comes to the basic structure of the face, it's a pretty standard anime look. Circle for the head, a curvy triangular shape for the chin. If you wanted, you could use a little square to show like the transition between the mid head to the chin. But this is pretty much a pretty standard anime look. Maybe throw in a little like curve for the ear and fill it in with some detail. Now, what really stands out for this anime, and probably a few other animes for this era, is the look that they kind of give the hair, which basically consists of drawing bangs using lots of curved triangular shapes. I like to pretty much consider it like little V's where the point of the hair meets at like a single point and everything goes up or down, because probably when you're drawing hair, you think more downward. And you just do that a few times, and that's kind of how you get the hair for this style. Now, what I think is really cool about what it does also is to give it a little bit more of a more abstract look, kind of getting away from a little bit of realism. Is it's not afraid to like show like some hair hanging off the side, way further away from the face. Even looking at a design like this, the end of her hair is about like a whole face size away from where her face actually ends. So definitely that brings a lot more expression to this style when drawing characters to make them look unique. And of course, you know, kind of keeping with this whole like Ronin samurai vibe, lots of long ponytails, flowing hair, definitely doesn't hurt for this style. Along with that, one thing that also brings out a lot of style for this is just kind of the simple glossy highlights in the hair that make it pop a little bit more, mainly covered in bangs and maybe some parts of flowier hair. I know from, you know, my personal experience trying to draw in a style like this, you really don't realize how much of a difference that glossy kind of finish to the hair makes when trying to make a style like this. So even though it's a small detail, it's very important for giving it its look. Usually characters that break this formula for hair usually just have like simple, highlighted shapes resembling more period accurate hairstyles, such as kind of like, you know, the signature like shaved top of the head samurai look, and a few others. And the one exception to that usually comes up for background characters that do have glossy highlights tends to be the characters with the Gecko Shimada hairstyle. I feel like this decision was made only because since it's a more complicated hairstyle, the glossy look kind of helps show the shape to see what's actually going on with the style, so it doesn't have to rely on like heavier line work and all of that. That kind of breaks what it already has going. But other than that, you know, everything seems to be pretty uniformed here. I do like every now and then when they throw in like the old school like spiky haired anime character. It definitely adds some personality and some fun to some of the background characters. The eyes in this art style usually also consist of like a little line for the under eye, a heavier line for the upper eyelash. Like with a lot of animes, more feminine characters have wider eyes that are more open, while masculine characters tend to have more narrow eyes. On that topic though, I couldn't possibly go past that without addressing two elements that really are main variations for this art style. So one thing that I do love is that this anime is definitely not afraid to show goofiness in faces. The background characters tend to have more circular eyes, kind of breaking the like bottom lid, top lid line formula. And in my mind, this is kind of just make the character look a little goofier, since it is an action comedy show. And simple circular eyes kind of promote the lighthearted energy and vibe to it. Villainous characters tend to have more rectangular eyes with like curves to make it look more eye-like, and smaller pupils with no highlights. So they're a little bit closer to the main characters, but just simplified so it doesn't have the eye highlights and everything. I think in that way, it's to kind of help with staging to show that they aren't the main characters. Put a little bit less charm since the little highlights in the eyes tend to make the character feel a little bit more charming by making the eyes more in depth when you're looking at them. Now, one thing I wanted to also point out about eyes is the way it varies to show a little bit more androgyny. And this is more exemplified with the main character having kind of a mix of both kind of eye styles. Being a little bit more narrow, like a more masculine eye, but still having that openness and curve of a feminine eye style. And one thing about this anime also is, whether it was a super intentional goal or not, it does really play with the element of androgyny quite a bit in a way that I really think makes it stand out. And kind of giving it some thought, it was definitely an intentional choice, considering how many zoom-ins on this character's eye there is, kind of just to show the coolness of all of it. So yeah, they definitely know what they were doing when designing like the main character with a more unique eye style. Other than that, the eyes, the hairs, the ears, eyebrows, mouths are pretty typical to anime at the time. The nose tending to just be like a long half triangle with the point closer to the bottom and a stronger outline. But once again, that only seems to apply to the main characters of this anime. Kind of hilariously, background characters seem to be an absolute free-for-all for nose shapes, with the most common one being like 3/4 of a rectangle, with some characters just having like full-on drawn noses with like every shape of the nose having an outline. I also think this is just to kind of add to kind of some of the goofiness to show with some of the more unserious characters that there's just lighthearted energy here, and that when it doesn't need to, it's not taking itself too seriously on consistency. That being said though, a lot of the elements of comedic style can root back to like the beginning of anime history, probably having some roots in cartoons even before anime. While the elements portrayed more with the main characters is something I noticed that kind of started popping up a little bit more after the mid-80s and just kind of going onward, still having a lot of influence in modern anime. The one thing I do have to point out as a bit of a no-no for this art style is the subtle colorism that seems to be apparent. And it's a little hard for someone like me who's hyper-analyzing the media to miss out on. There seems to be a bit of a habit of drawing rougher and tougher looking characters with darker skin tones, and like the prettier characters with lighter skin tones. And I know that gets into a much deeper cultural discussion that goes past just this particular anime, but just a note to the casual artist or just art nerd watching, I wouldn't recommend following up on this trend for your work if you ever do that, since it's one element I would consider a little bit problematic of this art style. Now, I won't go too deep into the fashion design of this video. It's pretty basic and standard for the period accurate clothing. And maybe I will cover this anime along with a few other medias if I do a separate video on the samurai aesthetic, as I also plan to do some videos on just general aesthetics decoded. But since nothing really stands out as super unique that can't also be shown in other media, I won't go too far into fashion in this video. Alright, so for this part of the video, I'm going to switch things up a little bit. Now, all the colors I'm using from this point forward are colors that are actually taken straight from the anime and are normal colors in the color palette. I'm going to start by talking about lighting and shading first, so I'll get back to color in a bit, but just to kind of add to the vibe from this point forward in the video. So, there's not much to say about the style of the anime in terms of like art fundamentals. That hasn't already kind of been said about the character design, since I went over quite a bit with the character design section. One thing I will point out that isn't like directly unique to this anime, but definitely still worth pointing out, is the pretty consistently used watercolor style backgrounds that kind of show things being further off in the distance. And just briefly going over shading, face shading usually consists of under the hair and under the head shadows. So you usually see it like under bangs or like under the neckline for characters, which once again is very common for anime. Clothes folds tend to also have shading, most notably with the underfolds to show that there's more volume. So often, like, you know, the bottom of the shirt will have like a shadow just to show that it's tucked. And for more form-fitting outfits, you'll sometimes see like shadows under the chest also to kind of show like shape and all of that. And of course, you know, you'll see shading in the folds and all of that. But besides that, nothing too crazy. Sometimes when the anime just feels like flexing on you though, it will have shading wrapped around the face, which usually is at a scene that happens at night when, like, you know, a face is illuminated by the moonlight. And while it looks cool as hell, it's not anything that noteworthy either. Now, coming back to this color palette, while it's nothing groundbreaking, I always find that the color palette choices for older anime is so fascinating. But yeah, just taking a look at the color palette, the first thing that jumped out at me when actually trying to pull some of these colors is that the white used for Ran's top is like a very unique color that no other white ever uses, and I find that to be a very interesting choice. So, um, so when you actually look at it, it's actually a little bit closer to a blue, which is probably one of the elements that makes this character feel so cool. Quite literally having a cooler tone than the rest of the characters with a unique top. In addition, you'll probably notice a lot of these colors tend to be quite faded, kind of hanging a little bit closer to the gray border. I know looking into it, you could probably find tons and tons of reasons why older anime tend to have a little more like gray brown leaning colors. What I know, it kind of is a mix between like how they stored stuff, kind of what technology they had also, since I imagine animating would be a lot easier with a limited color palette rather than one with a ton of colors. But I'm right now, if I go over that, it will probably just be a video on older anime in general, and once again, probably not to be covered in this video. Alright, so the last thing I'm going to go very in depth with right now is staging. Staging is by far the most noteworthy thing in this anime, and what honestly was immediately what jumped out to me before anything else happened. So what we're going to do is take this little fight scene that happened in episode 1, kind of break down what happened, and talk about why the decisions were made that it did to make it give it the factor of like a cool samurai fight. So here, the scene starts with the angry samurai boss in the center of the screen. Lively, expressive, and loud, clearly the instigator of whatever is going to happen next. Pointing towards the screen, which the viewer is meant to interpret as Ran being on the other side of that screen, making the point feel a little bit more personal, putting you in her point of view. A few seconds after that, the camera moves to the other samurai as he walks towards the center, with the camera following him once he hits the center, introducing that he is the next big deal and the big threat. The camera once again jumps to Ran, showing a little bit more of the background as the samurai approaches, showing that in this moment, the attention is on the two of them, seemingly about to fight. But our main character seems to be currently pretty cool and minding their own business, not really being as much of an instigator of this force as the scene progresses. The camera finally centers on the main character's face then, and as they talk a little bit of smack, this is showing that at this moment now our main character is fully engaged in this fight, also centered just like the other opponent, as the fight is about to heat up. And without a second to waste, the samurai has a quick flash of anger, pulling out his sword and charging, as Red shows a less intense pose, ready to swing, but holding steady until they clash. The camera jumps back to show the two of them standing from an upward zoomed out angle, showing that the fight has officially started, and both fighters are now officially engaged. And staying at this angle to show for at least a moment, both fighters are on somewhat equal footing. Now, for the next section, this kind of quickly changes as the camera goes back and forth between the zoomed out angle and some zoomed in angles, cutting around to make the fight feel fast and personal, creating the illusion that you don't have enough time to take in all the details of the fight due to how fast it is, and that you kind of have to pick and choose what you're paying attention to. But at this moment, there is an implied kill slash that isn't actually shown, but implied by the sudden lack of action for a few seconds from the other samurai after the zoomed-in attack landed. And while it leaves the viewer with a bit of a curiosity for what happened, eventually the other samurai falls, and the match is clearly won by our main character. And when I talk about, the clever staging used, it feels like so much has happened in what was basically only a 20-second fight, which is crazy to me. But what I love even more is what happens after that fight. And I took so much time to show that 20-minute fight on how the effects kind of messes with your perception of the fight, only because in the next fight that happens immediately after, there was a huge contrast. Because in the next scene, after seeing the defeat of who was considered to be the big bad, all of the henchmen kind of zoom into the center to start fighting. And at this moment, it's such a cool looking sequence because unlike all of those jump cuts and everything it did to show a very fierce, intense, and equal fighting, and for this fight, it more or less only has a zoomed out camera that has one angle, and the only real switches are the switches between Iran and Miao. With the contrast of how calm this fight is, it's really showing the skill difference that this fight is not a struggle. Like, these two are clearly taking down hordes of enemies without breaking a sweat. As with the last one, it was fierce, it was in your face, it seemed like it was a little bit more equal due to, a little bit of the struggle that the camera seemed to be having. While episode 1 for sure showed some of the most impressive fights in the anime, the technique of center staging and jump cuts is a huge part of what makes the action in this anime feel so cool, with most of the timing of the action generally being executed in no more than 5 frames. And that's a technique that I would say, if there's anything I took away from this anime in terms of style, it is for sure that, because it made all the fights seem infinitely cooler, which I really appreciated. I had a lot of fun watching them. When watching this anime, a lot of the thoughts that were provoked were thoughts of, obviously one was nostalgia, as it took me back to the time where a lot of animes were like this. I kind of felt like a great sense of kind of joy, playfulness, and at the same time really just admiration for these characters and how cool they were and what they were doing, and really rooting for them on their adventure. A formula used in this story is that it's very much a kind of an episodic Monster of the Week style narration, not without actual monsters, but it always was set up with kind of introducing a mysterious concept, and then as maybe a fight happens or something, a little bit more details of that mysterious conflict is brought up. As they investigate that concept, they get closer to the truth, usually have a one face-off, and then find a resolve. It's a setup that's kind of cut and dry and to the point, which is why I mentioned that, it gets a little repetitive sometimes if this is a show you want to straight binge. But I will say, it's a formula that definitely works. So, because, as long as I kind of watch this in intervals, I definitely was always curious about where each of these episodes were going to go, and it does a very good job setting it up. In addition to that, the reason I kind of mentioned why I really like the androgyny in Ran's design is because, while it was their intent or not, it's really cool to see an anime with a lead female character that isn't hyperly leaning into an appeal. Now, I will say, while editing, I did get to listen to both the sub and the dub, and while I'm not usually that much of a stickler, you'll never really hear me saying you should definitely do sub or definitely do dub. I say whatever works best for you. But for this anime in particular, I will say the sub definitely was my choice, as I wasn't actually the biggest fan of the dub. Not because of the voice acting, but because a good deal of lines were changed in the dubbing, that really kind of almost made me feel like it changed the spirit of what it was trying to do. For example, I know in the sub, whether this is decision made by the subber I watched, or if it was more closer to the official translation, one thing that I do enjoy is that while every now and then, of course, there's jokes thrown around huh, you're strong for a girl, or something like that. Usually, aside from the occasional brag where Rand's yes, I'm just a beautiful drifter, or just, kind of flexing herself, it doesn't really feel like there's a big emphasis on the fact that she is a woman warrior. She kind of just is, and I think that really brings out way more of the coolness of that appeal. But in addition to that, that's just kind of on the direction so that it's not overly leaning into feminizing the character. It still definitely felt to me with a show with a lot of feminine energy, despite that, and that feels very cool. To be honest, watching this, I was yo, this is just the story of two lesbians just going on adventures together, and it's really cute, and I really enjoyed that aspect of it. Now, that's part of the reason why the dub kind of killed it a little bit for me, because it did lead way more into feminizing the character and constantly reminding you that these are women, and all the men are making fun of that and all of that. And while I wouldn't say it's a hard reason not to watch the dub, because I don't want to ever discourage that if it works for you, as long as it's not a horrible dub. Because to its credit, I did enjoy the voice actors. There were a few voices that I was very surprised to see pop up in this. It was definitely, I could tell time was taken into dubbing this. But For me, I have to say that the sub definitely carried an energy that really made the appeal of this show way more appealing to me, especially in a show that you don't want to feel like it's dating itself. And maybe that's what I'm getting on about as I'm rambling about my different thoughts between the sub and the dub, is that it felt like the dub kind of dated itself more than the sub did. Which is funny because you feel like the point of localization is to make it more digestible for foreign audiences, but I guess in this case, I disagree. But like I said, this part is just me giving my honest thoughts about how I felt kind of going into the show, and why I definitely wanted to make a video about it. As always with these, it's more of an analysis, so obviously if something sucked, I might briefly mention it, but it's all really positivity here, so that, you know, if you're a fan of the show and you click this video to kind of like get a deeper analysis into it, that's kind of the purpose of it. It's more of like if this is something you enjoyed, or I guess hearing me talk about it, if you feel like you want to watch it now, it's kind of for you to understand why people feel appeal for stuff like this. And that's really what I'm trying to really hit the nail on the hammer with this series. Then, I know, I promised I would talk about music and sound effects earlier, but honestly, this was supposed to be like a 3-day video project, and we're like a week and a half later, so I kind of just want to get this video out at this point. But I definitely want to continue with more Decoded videos like this going forward, and it's definitely going to be like a trial and error process where I try some stuff, change some stuff, and kind of figure out, you know, how to increase the quality of this series. So, you know, I'm okay with this being a little bit of a rough video to start off with. But it would definitely help if you liked, subscribed, and at this point, I don't know if my Patreon is going to be ready by the time I post it, but if it is, make sure to check it out and support me on that. It really would help me a lot to make the most out of this series, just having your support to keep going, and I feel like I really have a reason to put time into this amongst my busy schedule, to continue pumping these out and to continue adding better quality to it. And one thing I will say is, at this point, I will claim that I am not a professional artist. I'll probably cover this in an introduction video to my channel, but the reason I did this series is because I'm currently kind of on a quest looking at a bunch of media and learning how I can improve my own style by analyzing things that I like. So it's gonna be a fun game of how many videos I need to say I'm not a professional artist in before the video comes and it's like, yes, I view myself as an artist, because it will happen one day. But for now, I'm just a bit of an art nerd analyzing these. But with that, enough rambling. This is it for this Decoded video. Like I said, if you really enjoyed it, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.